There's a moment that happens almost every day in your relationship, and you probably don't notice it happening at all. It is small. It takes less than 3 seconds. And it is not in the bedroom. Most men spend years learning what their partner wants in the most obvious moments of physical closeness, while completely missing the quieter ones, the ones that happen in hallways, in kitchens, in the 10 seconds after one of you walks through the front door. You keep missing this specific thing not because you are careless, but because nobody ever taught you to look for it. It was never labeled as important, so it slipped past you day after day, treated as nothing. Here is what I want you to sit with for the next few minutes. There is a question hiding underneath almost every quiet moment of touch in your relationship. A question she is asking without ever saying it out loud. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what that question is. And more importantly, you will start noticing the moment it gets asked. Today, in your own home, in a hallway or a kitchen you've walked through 1,000 times. Most men have exactly one script for physical affection. It starts with a hand on the waist and ends somewhere else. And for a long time, that script works. It gets responded to. It gets reciprocated. It feels like the entire language of touch between two people. Because for years, in a lot of relationships, it basically is. You learned it early, watching it work, and nobody ever sat you down to tell you it needed updating as time went on. Nothing about that script is wrong. It's simply incomplete. Think back to the early years of a relationship, when almost any touch felt charged with the same electric intention. A hand on the arm meant something. A lingering hug meant something. Everything pointed toward the same destination, and that felt exciting precisely because it was so singular. One language, one meaning, easy to read without any real effort. That singularity is what most men quietly assume will last forever, without ever consciously deciding to assume anything at all. Of course, desire itself doesn't disappear with time, but the role touch plays inside a relationship starts to widen, whether either partner consciously chooses that or not. This isn't a story about attraction fading with age. It's a story about attraction learning new words, quietly, in the background of ordinary life. And when a man keeps running the old, narrower script without noticing the terrain around him has changed, he starts missing signals that were never really there at the start of things, because they simply didn't need to be there yet. Nobody warns you about this shift, because it doesn't arrive as an event. It arrives as a drift, so gradual that most men only notice it in hindsight, if they notice it at all. There is no single day when the old script stops working entirely. It simply starts working less often, in ways that are easy to explain away individually. A slower response here, a shorter hug there. Nothing dramatic enough on its own to raise a flag. It is only when you step back and look at the pattern across months, rather than any single evening, that the shift becomes visible at all. But somewhere in her 40s, her body started asking for something that script doesn't include. Something shifts in a woman's relationship with touch after 40. And it's not about desire fading. It's about desire changing shape. Researchers who study attachment and nervous system regulation have observed that as people move through midlife, physical touch becomes increasingly tied to a sense of safety and being known, rather than only to arousal. In plain language, that means touch starts doing double duty. It still carries romantic and sexual meaning, the way it always has. But it also becomes a kind of ongoing proof that someone is paying attention to her, specifically, not generically, not the way anyone might be paid attention to in passing. This shift rarely gets announced. Nobody sits down one afternoon and says, "By the way, my relationship to touch just changed. We should talk about it." It happens quietly, underneath the surface of ordinary weeks, often overlapping with hormonal shifts, changes in stress load at work and at home, children needing less hands-on care, aging parents needing more, and a broader reassessment of identity that tends to surface strongly during the 40s for a lot of women. You might be thinking, isn't this just a natural part of getting older? And isn't that true for men too, not only women? And you'd be right to think that. It is not unique to women at all. Men experience shifts of their own during the same years. But because women are more often socialized from early on to notice and interpret touch as a form of communication, the shift tends to show up first and most clearly in what she responds to rather than in what she initiates on her own. This does not mean every woman experiences it identically, or on the exact same timeline. Context matters. Personality matters. The specific history of the relationship matters, but the underlying pattern shows up with remarkable consistency once you know to look for it, across very different women, in very different kinds of relationships, from very different backgrounds. There's also a practical reason this shift tends to land quietly instead of loudly. Most couples never develop a shared vocabulary for talking about how touch functions in their relationship. They simply absorb each other's habits over time, through trial and error, without ever naming what's happening out loud. So when the underlying meaning of touch starts to shift for one partner, there often isn't language ready to describe it, even for her. She may notice a kind of restlessness around old patterns of affection without being able to say precisely why. He may notice her responding differently to things that used to reliably land well, without any clear explanation offered. Neither of these experiences is a failure of the relationship. They're simply what happens when something evolves faster than the words available to describe it. That gap between the felt shift and the spoken explanation is exactly where most misunderstandings quietly take root. Not out of any lack of love, but out of a simple lack of shared words for something both people are experiencing differently. So if the old script isn't wrong, just incomplete, what's missing from it? There are 3 moments in an ordinary day where she's quietly taking notes. None of them happen in the bedroom. The first is the moment of reunion, the specific few seconds after one of you has been away, even briefly, even for something as small as a trip to the store. Picture walking back into the house after running an errand, or coming home from work at the end of an ordinary Tuesday. Nothing special about the day at all. In that window, before either of you has said much of anything, there is a small physical choice available. Do you close the distance? Or do you let her close it instead? Or does the distance simply stay open? Psychologists sometimes call this proximity seeking, the largely unconscious pull toward reducing physical distance from someone who matters to us emotionally. It shows up in children reaching for a parent's hand in a crowded store. And it shows up in a quieter and more adult form, in the first few seconds after a partner walks back through the door. When a man consistently closes that distance first, even with something as small as a hand briefly resting on her back while he sets down his keys, it registers as evidence that he was thinking about her while he was away, even if only for 20 minutes. When he doesn't, and the greeting becomes purely functional, a "Hey, how was your day?" thrown across the room while he checks his phone, it doesn't register as neutral. It quietly registers as absence, even if nothing was said and nothing was meant by it. The second moment is touch that arrives during stress, without being asked for and without leading anywhere else. A hand on the shoulder while she's on a frustrating phone call with the insurance company, the kind of call that leaves anyone tense. Sitting close, saying nothing, simply staying present while she works through something difficult entirely in her own head. This kind of touch communicates something very specific. I am not trying to fix this, and I am not trying to escalate this. I am simply here, next to you, while it's happening for as long as it takes. Of course, timing matters enormously here, maybe more than in any other moment we'll cover. Touch offered in the middle of genuine anger or real overwhelm can land as intrusive rather than comforting, which is why reading her state first is part of doing this well, not an afterthought tacked on at the end. Rushing in with a hand on the arm during the peak of frustration can feel more like a demand for reassurance than an offer of comfort, more about settling your own discomfort with her mood than settling hers. The pause before you reach out matters just as much as the reaching itself, and learning to read that pause is its own quiet skill. The third moment is subtler still, touch that clearly expects nothing back. A kiss on the forehead before leaving for work, with no lingering afterward. A brief squeeze of the hand across a restaurant table, with no follow-up glance checking for a response, no small performance of affection waiting to be noticed by her or by anyone else at the table. This type of touch is rare precisely because it requires a man to give something without immediately checking what he received in return. And that rarity is exactly what makes it register so strongly whenever it happens. Now, you might be thinking, couldn't a hand on the back or a quick hug just be habit, muscle memory, nothing especially deliberate at all? Sometimes, yes, and one instance on its own means very little, almost nothing by itself. But when these small gestures repeat consistently, without being prompted and without leading toward anything else afterward, they stop reading as habit and start reading as a pattern of attention. And pattern is what actually gets remembered, long after the specific Tuesday itself is completely forgotten. Before we move further, there is one additional layer worth mentioning that most explanations skip over entirely. Context always changes the reading of any given gesture. A hand on the waist in a crowded party means something different than the same hand on the waist at home on a quiet Tuesday night. And a woman is almost always tracking that difference somewhere underneath conscious thought, even when she couldn't fully explain it out loud if you asked her directly. Of course, none of this means physical intimacy stops mattering, or gets replaced by something smaller. It means the order got reversed. The relationship between the two doesn't disappear. It simply flips. Where sexual touch once opened the door to feeling close, ambient touch now tends to build the foundation that makes closeness of any kind feel safe to reach for in the first place. This isn't about men who don't care. It's about men who care in a language she stopped needing translated the same way she once did. Remember what I told you at the start of this video? That there was one signal most men not only miss, but actively misread when they do happen to notice it. We are getting close to it now. Think back to a conversation that once seemed completely ordinary, one where you walked away without realizing what had actually just happened underneath the surface of it. Maybe it was a goodbye at the door, rushed and distracted, phone half in your hand, mind already 3 steps ahead on the drive to work. Nothing was wrong in that moment. From your side of it, you weren't being careless on purpose. And yet, for her, it may have registered as the 40th version of the same rushed goodbye that month. A small data point quietly added to a running tally she isn't even fully conscious of keeping herself. Most men are trained from fairly early on in life to read touch as either functional or escalating. A pat on the back that means, "Good job, well done." A kiss that leads somewhere further, toward something else. What men are rarely taught to read at all is ambient touch, the kind that exists purely to signal ongoing presence, with no task attached to it and no destination in mind whatsoever. This isn't a failure of character, and it isn't a sign that something is fundamentally wrong. It's closer to a gap in translation, something nobody ever explained rather than something anybody actively broke. You might be thinking, but I already do plenty of thoughtful things for her. Does the touch really matter that much on its own, separate from everything else? And the honest answer is that it depends what it's quietly replacing in the relationship. If thoughtful action and physical presence are both showing up consistently, you're likely already in good shape, and this may matter less than it would otherwise. But if physical presence has gradually dropped out of daily life while everything else continues as normal, the absence tends to get felt far more sharply than any of those other things can fill in for, no matter how thoughtful they are. This is part of why a man can feel genuinely confused when a relationship cools. Even though he's doing everything right by his own accounting, he's measuring the wrong column, checking off tasks while a quieter, less visible ledger runs low without his noticing. One that never sends a statement or a warning before it empties out completely. Once you can see the moment clearly, the next question becomes what you actually do inside it. Here's the one almost no one talks about. Not because it's complicated, but because it asks for nothing in return, and that alone makes it easy to overlook. Of everything covered so far, this is the piece that gets missed most consistently, even by attentive, genuinely caring men who are otherwise doing almost everything right. It is this. The single strongest trust signal after 40 is touch offered with truly zero expectation of anything back. Not gratitude, not reciprocation, not even a small moment of acknowledgement afterward. Behavioral researchers who study long-term pair bonding have noted that gestures with no immediate payoff function as unusually strong evidence of security within a relationship, precisely because they can't be explained away as strategy or quiet performance. If a gesture is clearly not building toward anything else, it can only really mean one thing at its core: a hand resting briefly on her shoulder as you pass behind her chair, with no pause, no comment, nothing at all that asks her to respond in any particular way. That single gesture, repeated over time, can do more for a sense of safety in the relationship than an entire vacation carefully planned to impress her. This is the moment we opened with at the very start of this video. The one happening almost daily, invisible, asking a quiet question underneath it. Are you still choosing me? Even when nothing is being asked of you, and nothing is being offered back to you in return? That is the actual question. And the honest, simple truth is that most men are already fully capable of answering it well, without needing to change who they fundamentally are. They simply never realized the question was being asked in the first place because nobody ever framed it out loud this way. Once you know what to look for, you'll start noticing it everywhere. Starting today, in small moments that used to pass by completely unnoticed. And here is the part worth sitting with for a moment. This kind of gesture costs almost nothing to give. It doesn't require money, planning, or a special occasion. It requires only that you remember, in an ordinary moment with nothing at stake, to reach out anyway. Not because the moment called for it, but simply because she was there, and you wanted to. That single willingness, repeated quietly over years, tends to matter more than almost anything else we've discussed today, precisely because of how little it demands and how much it reveals. There is also a reassuring side to this, worth naming directly. You don't need to invent a new gesture, or turn yourself into someone you're not, to give this. Most men already have a version of this instinct somewhere in them, the impulse to reach out for no reason, just because she's near. Life gets busy, distraction becomes the default setting, and that instinct quietly goes unused for long enough that it starts to feel unfamiliar. Reviving it isn't about learning something foreign. It's closer to remembering something you already knew how to do. What all of this comes down to, in the end, is a single unified idea. After 40, touch becomes less about performance and more about proof. Quiet, repeated proof that someone still chooses to close the distance, even when nothing at all requires it of them. That is the underlying principle beneath every single signal we walked through today, from the doorway to the dinner table and back again. You now have something most men never get handed directly, a way of seeing gestures that used to look like nothing, and recognizing them for what they actually are underneath the surface. And to be clear, you do not need to start overanalyzing every touch, tracking it like a scoreboard, or performing affection on a schedule as though it were a task on a list. That would completely miss the point of everything we just covered together. The goal here isn't vigilance, and it was never meant to be. It's attention that comes from genuine care, offered without keeping score of what comes back afterward. I'd love to know what you noticed in your own life while watching this today. So tell me, when was the last time you noticed her lean into a touch that had nothing to do with sex? What was happening in that moment specifically? I read every single comment on this channel, because these details are exactly what shape the next video we make together. If this gave you a new way of seeing something familiar, subscribing means you won't miss what's coming next, because there's a companion piece to everything we covered today. Next time, I'll show you the exact moment in her day when she quietly decides whether she felt invisible or seen. And it isn't when you think it is.